Are you okay to start? Yeah, let's go. Subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. The U.S.-India relationship can be characterized simply, one of enormous potential. It is in the interest of this subcommittee and the United States to see democratic societies prosper. And it's because of this view, India is a natural partner for the United States. The 1.3 billion person nation, it has become the focus of U.S. trade and business opportunity. People-to-people connections between the two countries undergird and bolster this relationship. As a growing military power, India is also a critical global security partner with the potential to help avert military confrontation and conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. Indeed, both the United States and India recognize the potential partnerships between the world's fastest growing large economy and the world's most powerful economy. In light of this, we should expect that bilateral trade has much more room to grow. We convene this hearing today to discuss the U.S.-India economic relationship. Trade in goods and services have ballooned between 2005 and 2015. Both countries have prioritized the economic relationship, aiming to reach $500 billion in bilateral trade in goods and services by 2024, a 5-fold increase from the 2014 level. To achieve this, it's greatly important that India continue substantive economic reform by opening its markets. But substantive challenges remain, including speculation about India's domestic growth prospects, limits to market accessibility, and concerns about intellectual property rights protection. When Prime Minister Modi came into power in 2014, he shouldered high expectations for an economic transformation. While his leadership continues to hold the promise of a new economic era for India, observers have become frustrated with the slow pace of reform. India's economic growth rate at 7.6% will not be enough to generate sufficient jobs for India's exploding population of young people. On top of that, these issues are exacerbated by an overbearing and corrupt bureaucracy, insufficient infrastructure development, heavy regulation, and high social spending. Meaningful reform has been hindered by domestic policies and parliamentary gridlock. A critical component of India's economic reform will be its involvement in multilateral economic institutions. India has for 20 years shown an interest in joining the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, a regional organization that supports economic growth through free and open trade and investment, promoting regional integration and encouraging economic cooperation, among other things. This has been an ambition that our executive branch has welcomed and encouraged. To assist in accelerating the relationship towards this goal, I plan on introducing a bill to support India's membership in APEC this week. Thanks to my colleague, Mr. Bera, who has been working with me on putting this bill together. Our two countries are also in the midst of discussions on a high standards bilateral investment treaty, or BIT. If achievable, the BIT would deepen our economic relationship and support economic growth and job creation in both countries. These sorts of positive currents and potential achievements for Indian economic policy would illustrate a movement towards greater openness and harmonization with global free market principles that will be beneficial to India and the U.S.-India relationship and both of our economies. Such reforms would pave the way to accelerated growth India needs, and the increased openness would allow our countries to exploit our comparative advantages. Experts estimate that a successful BIT agreement, for example, could increase U.S. goods exports to India by 50% or more and could double service exports. A successful BIT could even pave the way forward towards a free trade agreement with India. Despite the slow pace of reform, India's economy remains a bright spot amidst global economic troubles, particularly for developing nations. It's still the world's fastest growing large economy And I look forward to hearing about the U.S.-India economic relationship and the opportunities and challenges that encompass it, and how the United States can best support and nurture the bilateral economic relationship. And I'd like to recognize Mr. Sherman for any opening statement he'd like to have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. With a population of 1.25 billion people, India is the world's largest democracy in history. Some 550 million people voted in the last nationwide elections. When you look at the people of India, you see that many have moved outside India to create a diaspora. Everywhere in the world, that diaspora is considerably more educated and considerably wealthier than the country in which it is located. In fact, it's the only place you can go to find a poor person of Indian heritage is India. And I'm confident that as India gets better governance, it will emerge as one of the richer countries in the world. The United States and India share many core values, including religious pluralism, individual freedom, the rule of law, and electoral democracy. And both have rejected and are working together against radical Islamic extremism. The Indo-American community in the United States is a vital link between the two countries and help build bridges. New Delhi has played an important role in regional peace and security. Its growing economic power adds to its ability to deal with strategic issues. India's growth path shows that it can be compared to China. I used to be a business advisor and now and then give free business advice to those of my constituents foolish enough to ask me for it. And I point out that an investment in India makes a lot more sense than one in China. In India, you have the rule of law. In India, you also have the long-term stability, messy as it is, of governing institutions. The United States during the Great Depression showed that democracy can survive a 20, 30, even 40% decline in GDP. I do not think that a system of government built around a party that got power by claiming to be the vanguard of the proletariat, but now says it's not, could survive even 0% economic growth for a year or two. So while China gives this image of stability, it does not have a system which could explain to its people why certain individuals hold positions of power. Over the past decades, we've seen the U.S. Work to bring India out from nuclear isolation and, of course, increase defense and security cooperation. The International Energy Administration estimates that India will require $2.1 trillion of investment in its power sector, and of course India is looking to develop its own oil and natural gas resources and is seeking $25 billion of investment there. I want to do everything possible to make sure that the tremendous amount of equipment that is necessary for this power expansion is produced in America by American workers. I was one of 83 members of Congress, along with at least several people in this room, to urge that this House provide Prime Minister Modi with our highest honor we can provide a foreign leader, and that is an invitation to address a joint session of Congress. While the schedule couldn't be worked out last time, I look forward to hearing Prime Minister Modi while sitting on the House floor. We look forward to expanding our trade relationship, which is now at only $110 billion. I believe the Vice President and others have announced the goal of expanding that to $500 billion of bilateral trade. But I will point out that this has got to be balanced trade, that the people of this country have, in case we haven't noticed, risen to totally repudiate the trade policies that we followed so far, which are misnamed free trade. Every single presidential candidate with over 150 delegates has absolutely repudiated the trade policy that has guided us over the last 20 years. Now, some of them have done it rather reluctantly, but all of those who are still significant candidates have done so. So the people of this country look forward to expanding trade around the world on a balanced basis, not with the United States running huge trade deficits. And it will take a completely different model of trade to achieve that. And those who come to the American people and just say all trade is good no matter whether it's balanced or not will be, have been utterly repudiated by the people of this country. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Barrett, did you care to make an opening statement?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member. I had a chance to travel to India with the chairman of the subcommittee as well as the chairman of the full committee last year, and then recently returned to India a few months ago. And you still feel this sense of optimism in India, the sense that the economy, while it's not a straight shot, is still quite vigorous and vibrant. And I thank the chairman's leadership on the resolution that we'll be introducing this week to really encourage India's joining of APEC, because that probably is the next logical step as they undergo the economic reforms and undergo much of the agenda that Prime Minister Modi has put out there. And that, for us to realize this potential that both the President and Vice President has said, of creating the defining relationship in the 21st century and trying to take the bilateral trade from $100 billion to $500 billion. APEC membership's a good next step. It'll take us a little bit longer to get that high standard bilateral investment treaty, but that certainly is an aspirational goal for both countries and really can set the framework for bilateral trade. On our side, I urge patience. The economic reforms in India will take time. I think we have to look at this longer time horizon. And on the Indian side, we encourage the Prime Minister to continue the economic reforms to ease the ability of our companies to do business, to put in good intellectual property and patent protections that don't hinder that investment, and also to open up and ease the ability for U.S. resources and U.S. venture to help India realize its potential. I mean, these are all achievable goals. It requires patience on both sides of the Pacific. It requires open dialogue, and I remain very optimistic that we can reach those goals. So, I look forward to hearing the testimony of witnesses who are all experts on this relationship. And again, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Meng, did you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member, and thank you to our witnesses who are here today to testify on U.S.-India relations. I represent one of the largest Indian-American diasporas in Congress, and the people-to-people relationship has been a driving force behind the bringing of our countries closer together. Under this president, our countries have grown closer, and we share renewed commitment to working together, particularly in the economic sphere. Principles of our joint commitment were laid out first in September 2014, when U.S. and Indian leaders committed to expanding and deepening the strategic partnership in a vision statement entitled Jalain Sat Sat, Forward Together We Go. And following President Obama's second state visit to India in January 2015, we released a joint statement outlining an extensive, detailed commitment in a variety of industries. But while it is clear that there is a deep interest and commitment on both sides, there is still a lot of groundwork we must do to realize this vision. I look forward to hearing from you on how you see the status of this commitment from India and how we can best address some of the existing challenges. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lowenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for joining us today. And, sitting on this committee, I realize just what an increasingly complex world we live, but how interdependent we are with our global neighbors, how we look forward to working to promote peace, security, economic growth, development, and with India's India especially, with representing such a huge population, proportion of the world's population. I want to know how we can both influence and effectively advance both our national interests and at the same time do that in a way that improves our relationships. You know, there are many challenges in front of us. This committee in the world, in this globe, sees them all. But I want to hear how we can, in this committee and Congress, support better relationships with India, how we can support their economic development, their democratic aspirations, and not just of India, but really the democratic aspirations of the entire region, and how we together can work together for that. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're very fortunate today to be joined by three very distinguished panelists. First, Alyssa Ayres, PhD Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan, South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Dr. Ayres. Mr. Sadanand Dhume, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Richard M. Rossow, Senior Fellow and Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we'll begin with you, Dr. Ayres.
Sorry.
There.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you today on U.S. economic ties with India. I'm honored to be part of this distinguished panel. I shared in advance with the committee a recent Council on Foreign Relations independent task force report for which I served as project director. I respectfully request that the report and my more detailed written statement be submitted for the record. In the last 15 years, India has experienced significant economic growth, and the bilateral economic relationship has changed substantially. After several years hovering below the $100 billion level, in 2014, two-way trade in goods and services crossed that threshold, and last year reached $107 billion. U.S. exports to India now support more than 180,000 American jobs, as Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker said last year. U.S.-India defense trade has increased from zero to around $13 billion cumulatively. Technology and entrepreneurship are increasingly a bridge between both countries. At the same time, U.S.-India trade remains well below its potential, only a little more than 1/10 U.S.-China trade in goods, and more on the scale of Taiwan or the Netherlands. India and the United States also have market access differences. I do not intend to minimize these concerns, for they certainly exist, but I will focus my remarks on the future strategic horizon we should bear in mind. India's future potential. According to International Monetary Fund data, India's GDP crossed the $2 trillion threshold in 2014. At market exchange rates, India was the world's 9th largest economy that year, surpassing Russia. India is now growing at around 7.3% annually, which in 2015 made India the fastest growing major economy in the world given China's slowdown. India, as you know, does not fare as well when looking at per capita GDP. When looking at per capita at market exchange rates, India's nearly $1,700 level ranks it in the bottom third. Still, the prospect for India's middle class to grow substantially in the coming decades is not in doubt. A strong economic base will allow India to continue on its path of rising global power, including by enabling its military modernization, making the country a bulwark of democracy and stability in an expanded region from the Middle East to East Asia, where both are not always in ample supply. I referred to the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force. One of its top findings was that if India can maintain its current growth rate, let alone attain sustained double digits, it has the potential over the next 20 to 30 years to follow China on the path to becoming another $10 trillion economy. Few countries have such potential. India has its own political work to do to realize these ambitions, and it will not be easy. These are challenges that the United States can do little about. But we have a clear stake in India achieving its ambitions. The task force recommended that the United States elevate support for India's economic growth and its reform process to the highest bilateral priority. I will provide several recommendations for how to do this at the end of my testimony. Preparing the United States for a more global India. We have a problem of underinvestment and insufficient attention to India in United States higher education, an economic preparedness issue for our own country. The ranking of top study abroad destinations tells an obvious story about American interest in Europe, but China has overtaken Germany as a destination. Nearly twice as many American students head to Costa Rica for an experience abroad than to India. Language enrollment data is yet more dispiriting. Students in U.S. colleges and universities do not sign up for Indian languages at the levels they do for languages like Arabic, Chinese, or Korean. Here's an example. Enrollments for Hindi were only 1,800. All Indian languages combined were around 3,000. This means that the total enrollments in all Indian languages combined account for less than 1/4 those of Korean. Let me offer now a few recommendations for U.S. policy on these issues. First, elevate support for India's economic growth to the highest bilateral priority on the U.S. agenda with India. Steps recommended by the CFR-sponsored Independent Task Force report include leadership of a global diplomatic effort to support India's entry into APEC, completion of a bilateral investment treaty, high-level discussion of bilateral sectoral agreements such as in services, identification of a longer-term pathway to a free trade agreement or Indian membership in an expanded TPP as an equivalent, creation of initiatives that respond to Indian interest in domestic reform needs such as technical advice on infrastructure finance, and continued emphasis on defense trade and technology. Second, as India becomes an increasingly central global economy, the United States should work to integrate India in global economic institutions. I mentioned APEC. There are other institutions in which India should become a member, such as the OECD and the International Energy Agency. Finally, prepare our next generation in India in the global economy. Review federal funding incentives to encourage study abroad in India and study of Indian languages. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ayres. Mr. Dhume.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee on U.S.-India relations, democratic partners of economic opportunity. I'm Sadanand Dhume, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute based here in Washington, D.C. My comments today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of AEI. Since our time is limited, I would like to take this opportunity to make 4 broad points on which I will then elaborate. Number 1, the U.S.-India relationship is a pivotal relationship for the future of the Asia-Pacific and indeed the world. Number 2, at a time of political turbulence, it's important for us not to lose sight of the economic principles that have helped make this country the strongest and most prosperous in human history. These include an openness to trade and a welcome mat for talented professionals from around the world. Number 3, after the election of Prime Minister Narendra Modi 2 years ago, India is on the cusp of change. The US cannot determine the policies India will follow, but by the force of its example and its advocacy, it can nudge India in the direction of policies that will grow its economy, eradicate poverty, and make it one of America's major global trade partners. And finally, number 4, US economic policy towards India should be tethered to twin goals: to help India achieve its economic potential and to strive to remain India's top trading partner in goods and services. I'll spend the remainder of my time to expanding briefly upon each of these 4 points. The first, of course, is that the US-India relationship is pivotal. Sandwiched between a rising China and the turmoil of Afghanistan and Pakistan, India represents an anchor of democratic stability in an uncertain part of the world. The US stakes in India go beyond economics, but arguably no aspect of the relationship is more important than the economic one. Simply put, the US ought to view the goal of making India prosperous in a way similar to which it viewed South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan during the Cold War. This is part of a larger strategic goal which is important to the United States given what is unfolding in Asia. In purchasing power parity terms, India is currently the 3rd largest economy. But as a US trading partner, it is only number 10 in terms of goods trade. And I think that gap between those 2 numbers, number 3 and number 10, really sums up the challenge that we face, but also the opportunity for further growth. And in terms of India's own potential, though it has had 25 years of rapid growth of above 6% a year, in terms of per capita income, it remains at $5,700 a year in purchasing power terms, which is, to put it in perspective, less than half of China. So again, we've seen quite a dramatic success story over the past 25 years, but there remains a lot of potential for further growth. I also think that we should keep sight of our larger principles, particularly at a time of turbulence. Arguably now, more than ever, we need to stand by the ideas that have been the bedrock of prosperity for more than 200 years. And this means leading by example in terms of openness to trade in both goods and services, while at the same time ceaselessly advocating for greater economic freedom in India. I would like to say in particular that some of the debates about Indian tech firms tend to lose sight of the fact that they have been an asset for US competitiveness, and Indian tech workers have been productive members of society. India is on the cusp of change. In 2014, Narendra Modi was elected Prime Minister with India's first single-party majority in 30 years. Mr. Modi earned a reputation as an efficient, business-friendly administrator. He has embarked upon reforms, but those reforms have not gone fast enough for many observers. Nonetheless, he is less than 2 years into a 5-year term, and he remains the single best bet for India to achieve the economic transformation that it ought to achieve, and it remains in the United States' interest to back him as he makes these efforts. And finally, to sum up, I would say that all US policy goals, including some of those mentioned by Dr. Ayres, such as backing India's APEC membership, supporting a bilateral investment treaty, I would add to that finding a way to work with India's most dynamic states such as Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, and also working to enlarge global economic institutions. All of these exist within a larger framework, and that larger framework is two twin ambitions. The first is to help India achieve its economic potential, and the second is to continue to be India's top trade partner in goods and services in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Rossow?
Great. Thank you, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing on U.S.-India economic relations. I will focus my remarks on two main issues that I think must be addressed in order to deepen our economic partnership with India and create new opportunities for American firms. First is that we have to bridge this gap that exists in our approaches to global trade, and the second is we must engage India's regional leaders more directly. Since Prime Minister Modi took office in 2014, our bilateral relationship has strengthened mightily, though I think in surprising ways, ways that we didn't expect to see. We expected the Modi government to have a strong economic focus, which it has within political limitations. But I think few could have expected was the establishment of a stronger ideological framework guiding the continued expansion of our strategic partnership. We now have a big disparity, shared security goals that guide that strategic partnership, highlighted, I think, by the Joint Strategic Vision on Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region signed last year. But we don't have a similar ideological construct that guides our economic engagement. Now, kind of following on what others have stated before me, but a few examples that highlight the lack of a common ground on global economic issues. Today, we're no further along than we were 8 years ago on signing this investment treaty. In fact, a little bit further away, since both the United States and India have amended our model treaties, which I think take them a bit further away than they were at the outset. India is not part of any of the wider trade agreements that the United States is a party of, and there a wide chasm remains between our positions on many issues in the World Trade Organization. Now, in truth, I think it's likely the Indian government will only begin to approach global trade talks more proactively once their agriculture and manufacturing industries become more globally competitive. The two sectors make up 70% of India's workforce, yet contribute only about 45% of India's GDP. But there are a wider range of shared interests. Both countries are hotbeds of innovation. We both have strong services economies. Both have large net trade deficits, particularly with China. We face similar challenges in the way that we've been engaging on global trade issues. And our firms bring complementary strengths to markets like sub-Saharan Africa. I think there is actually a foundation of issues that could create a bit of a more powerful economic narrative on why we should be partners rather than constantly fighting on these big global issues. Second issue I want to highlight is the importance of developing a more robust whole-of-government strategy to engage India's powerful state regional leaders. State governments, I mean, I've already heard a number of times today about Modi reform. Has he done enough? Has he not done enough? State governments actually have a much deeper control on India's business environment outside of things like high-level market access than national leaders do. Issues like electricity, water, sanitation, infrastructure, industrial licenses, and law and order. These are all issues that the states actually govern far more than the federal government has a hand in. India's two national parties, Congress and BJP, combined only control 16 of India's 29 states right now. With a few notable exceptions, most of these state leaders actually have very little vision today for what partnership with the United States looks like. In addition to the strong impact on the local business environment, regional parties in India also have a strong influence on central government policymaking. Regional parties hold a majority of seats in the upper house of India's parliament. And also, while we talk about the BJP's electoral victory in the 2014 national election, it is the first time in 30 years that any party won a single-party majority in the lower house of parliament. We can expect that in the not-too-distant future, we'll see coalition governments again. And these regional parties played a dramatic influence on policymaking in the last government under coalition governments. Now, taking a step back, I think the Modi government's track record on reforms is somewhat underappreciated. From the U.S. viewpoint, the day that he stepped into office, there were four main areas of contention in our economic relationship: contentious taxation policies, lack of progress on new market access reforms, particularly foreign equity caps, treatment of pharmaceutical patents, and the establishment of forced local content rules in several manufacturing sectors. Those are the four that I saw as really kind of driving the negative sentiments and the hope when Modi stepped into office. I'd say 2 years later, we've actually seen robust movement on cross-border taxation policies, and at the same time, dramatic improvement on foreign equity limitations. About 30 sectors have actually seen foreign equity limitations removed or lessened somewhat since he came into office. Though we have seen less movement on local content rules in manufacturing and patent laws. Now, these are, of course, the economic agenda as it matters to American firms and policymakers. There's also other reforms that I think haven't been appreciated on this side of the ocean, but in terms of growing the Indian economy and providing new opportunities for American firms, would do so. Liberalizing the oil and gas sector, they liberalized the coal sector, transparent auctions for the first time of public resources like spectrum and mining licenses, delicensing defense production to the private sector. These reforms and India's relatively high growth rates compared to other countries, I think, make it an important market to American firms, as has already been stated. Our economic relationship going forward will benefit from forging a set of shared principles behind global economic issues and for better engagement with India's powerful state leaders. I was also asked by the committee to offer a couple of recommendations for this committee and for Congress, and so two things that I have in mind on that. First, I think the pipeline of congressional visits is terrific, and I think using that kind of an opportunity to engage some of these regional leaders, as what happened with Prime Minister Modi, in fact, before he became the leader of the country, is important to maintain and build on. Not just Delhi and Bangalore and Bombay, but some of the other regional capitals as well. Second, we have an election coming up. And as I like to joke, you don't become Secretary of State based on your policy towards India. So we don't really know what the next administration, whoever it is, what their position is going to be on key issues in India. But Congress will still be there, and there's going to be an important role to make sure that we maintain quickly and deeply with India after the election takes place. So thank you again for inviting me to appear before the subcommittee.
Thank you very much. I think the reason that nobody gets to be Secretary of State based on their policy on India is they're not big enough troublemakers. So I guess we ought to be thankful for that. My two questions center on foreign direct investment. First of all, Prime Minister Modi recently launched efforts to boost India's domestic manufacturing base and promote economic growth from within with programs like Make in India campaign. Does the Make in India campaign program, does it discriminate against U.S. and foreign manufacturers and imports? And will this policy hinder direct foreign investment or foreign direct investment? Do you think that it will have an adverse effect maybe on, securing the kind of foreign investment it needs? And then secondly, related to their existing foreign direct investment policy, which prohibits foreign-owned businesses from selling items directly to the Indian consumers over the internet. Should that policy be one that Modi looks at reforming? Is that going to hurt foreign direct investment as well? So, Mr. Rossow, do you want to take a stab first, or?
Yeah, let me start with the second one on sales via the internet. I'm actually working on a piece right now that tried to break down the various and strange ways that companies have to contort in order to sell something to a consumer in India. So if you're selling to businesses, there's one regulatory regime. It's broken down. They already started to liberalize on e-commerce to some extent. The idea about marketplace, kind of like eBay, where companies, where individuals sell to individuals via an administered platform, that's already allowed, or to say it's not discriminated against. So that's one model that's allowed. If you manufacture in India, you're allowed to sell online directly to consumers. And if you have single brand investment in India, so like a Nike store or Apple store, you're allowed to sell directly to consumers. Those changes have been made largely under the Modi government so far. So they have incrementally, I think, been chipping away at the ban on foreign investment in e-commerce. But still, the big opening, I think, on a multi-brand, the kind of e-commerce platforms that we see here in the United States where you buy directly from businesses carrying multiple brands over the internet still isn't there. Now, my conversations with Indian officials, it's on the cusp. I should expect that's one of the reforms I think in the next year or two you're going to see. They've been, as I mentioned, kind of incrementally moving their way in that direction. So I think it's on, what I'd say, the short list of next FDI reforms. But as for the timing, is it 6 months from now, a year from now? Can't be sure.
Do you think that it could be a substantial enough reform so a company like, let's say, Amazon could actually sell directly to consumers? Do you think that it might liberalize that much?
Yeah, I think it might, but what you have to watch out for is, are there going to be provisions on local sourcing rules, things like that, that in other areas where they've opened up retail trade have proved to be a bit of a poison pill. So you always look for what are the qualifiers that will attach to a policy like that. Some policies get opened up to 100% foreign investment with very few restrictions. Other policies, you see things in there that would actually preclude investors coming in. Amazon, though, is actually one of the largest e-retailers in India right now, but it's on the marketplace model.
Right,
And
it's on a marketplace model, and otherwise they can sell to businesses, but they can't sell directly to consumers.
yeah, it's a strange tree watching the different ways you try to get something in consumers' hands.
What about the other question, and Dr. Ayres, you could address her, or Mr. Dhume, whoever feels more adequate, but the Make in India policy, does that have the potential to discriminate against foreign manufacturers, foreign investors, and is that something we should be maybe chatting with them about?
I think, first of all, having the platform of Make in India is first and foremost designed to attract foreign direct investment into India. And a lot of American companies that are manufacturing in India are taking advantage of that. So it is actually helpful to the larger revenue of some American companies. For example, General Motors announced $1 billion investment and a relocation of a factory last summer. Ford has one of their largest manufacturing facilities anywhere in the world in Gujarat. There's a long list of others. Since the Make in India initiative was announced in September 2014, there's been a trickle of major investment announcements. And so I think we would have to look at kind of individual sectors to see if there was anything that would preclude or prohibit or limit U.S. exports to India. So I don't think it's possible to answer that in a blanket kind of umbrella statement. But certainly it is the case that this is a platform that is helpful to some American manufacturers who are looking to produce for this huge and growing Indian market.
Let me take a quick stab at both of those. On the e-commerce, I would agree with what Rick said. It's important to keep in perspective that India's e-commerce market is one of the most interesting and one of the fastest growing in the world. There was a statistic recently I saw which said that the top 3 e-commerce sites in India now do more business than the top 10 offline retailers combined. One of those top 3 is Amazon. And so it's definitely there, it's a player. There is certainly room for further reform over there. I agree that it is probably coming down the pike, but the situation now, it's already, we do have, there is a stake. On Make in India, I think your question, it's exactly it's a very important question because there is a philosophical difference, and there's a difference between a Make in India which says, we're going to make India a more attractive place to do business, and a Make in India that says, we're going to make it hard to do business unless you make in India.
Right.
And I think that's what the question is driving at. I would say that so far, the emphasis of the government has been on the former, but it's certainly something that we should continue to watch and continue to pay attention to. But if you look at FDI over the last 20 months, the first 20 months of the Modi government, FDI in India has risen by 33%.
Right.
So it's definitely been very foreign investment friendly.
Thanks, Mr. Dhume. Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. In evaluating trade relationships, we all too often focus on revenue for American corporations or profits for American corporations and all too little emphasis is put on jobs for American workers. I'd point out that Japan runs a $5 billion surplus, or $4 to $5 billion surplus with India. Germany runs a $5 billion surplus with India. There are two possible explanations of why we're running a deficit. One is that our workers are not as good. The other is that our government is not as good at representing the interests of American workers. I think that the elites in Washington should plead guilty because it is the second and not the first. Mr. Rossow, what changes in U.S. law, policy, or regulation is India seeking?
Changes on this side, that's a great question. Rarely asked, I think, in our bilateral relationship. They want more visas. They want lower visa fees. They would like a Social Security agreement that allows Social Security payments made by H-1B holders to be exempted from payment or reimbursed at the other end. So they do have, I think, a short number of issues.
So all of those things relate to how immigrants and or diaspora workers are treated. Anything on trade?
On trade, you know, there are still some
Investment?
technology
Any of the things
goals.
that we usually negotiate, you know, anything that our trade representative's office would actually deal with?
You know, right now, we're looking at an investment treaty is probably the biggest thing that's on the agenda.
But it's on the agenda, but is there anything that India is seeking in that investment treaty, or are they just kind of talking to us because it's one of the things we like to talk about?
Yeah, every meeting I have with Indian government officials, they have a difficult time articulating, you know, what's kind of in it for them because they've got access to our market. So it really is, will that be attractive enough to bring new investors to India in the sectors they desire, rather than it being a market access opportunity for Indian firms on our side?
And that investment may deprive Americans of work. Indians watch a lot of movies. A lot of movies are made in India. What are the restrictions on American firms, Hollywood, having their movies exhibited on screens and TV sets in India? Mr. Rossow?
I'm not aware of any restrictions based on American movies being there. There's some restrictions on, you know, TV channels, foreign ownership of TV channels and things like that, which could be a pipeline for more American content to come into India, but otherwise unrestricted.
Is any of the other witnesses aware?
I was just in India last week, and I watched The Revenant with my parents, and they absolutely loved that bear scene. So a lot of Hollywood movies in India, I believe.
Yeah, there are a lot of Hollywood movies in China,
Netflix-
but they restrict us to 30 or 40 movies. There
Netflix
are no
has just-
similar restrictions in India?
Netflix has
Good.
just come to India also, and I expect to do quite well. It's a large market.
What are the primary barriers to U.S. companies exporting goods and services to India? Mr. Rossow?
Well, there still are a number of sectors where they've put up restrictions on foreign companies selling in the market. So, for instance, let's talk about defense trade. There's a 30% direct offset requirement for defense sales, so you have to produce some portion of that locally. The solar policy, which demands local content to qualify for certain tax benefits. There was policies developed during the last government, which this government hasn't removed, which look at local content as well for government contracts on electronics, on communications, things like that. So there are a wide range of sectors where there are, I think, more explicit rules that limit American trade or force, you know, some amount of local content to be able to qualify for certain deals. Those are the main ones that I'm aware of.
India will be building nuclear power plants. We in Congress stepped forward and approved the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. The thinking in India is that there will be some plants built by the United States, but as a practical matter, Russian and French firms are government owned, and therefore they have sovereign immunity and could never be sued, whereas any U.S. firm could be. We've turned to other countries to have liability protection, which really just puts our companies in the same position as the French and Russian companies. Obviously, Bhopal is still remembered in India. We voted for the U.S.-India Energy Cooperation Agreement. We're going to get any jobs out of it, Mr. Rossow?
I think we will. I mean, talks about actually creating a liability regime in India that will accommodate American interests for developing are ongoing. American companies aren't allowed to actually invest in the plants there, so it's going to be contracts as suppliers. Will the material be built in India? Probably not anytime soon for American companies. So I think so, but it depends upon whether or not they get this workaround for the liability issue done in a way that accommodates American trading concerns. So it looks like it's headed in the right direction, but nothing's done.
And I'll ask one other question.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I'll just add to that very briefly. I think that it's a completely valid concern, and I think that there is reason to be concerned that this has taken so long, and that despite many years after the agreement, there hasn't been concrete.
Is it well understood in India that they are, in effect, providing liability insulation for the French and Russian companies?
I think it's viewed, as you alluded to in your question, mostly through the prism of Bhopal, which is why you had that liability law passed in 2010, which was very tough. But I think there's something that we sometimes lose sight of when we're discussing the nuclear issue, which is that though there may not have been sufficient progress on that particular issue, the nuclear deal really has unlocked the relationship in many other ways.
I thank you for that. I'm going to try and
spoke
sneak in
about-
one more question with a two-word answer from each witness. Pick 2 states in India where you think it's easiest for Americans to do business.
Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, I'd say.
Yeah, Andhra Pradesh. I'll say Maharashtra just to be a little bit different.
Is Gujarat one of your 2? Or?
Yeah, I probably would pick that. If you give me 3, I'd say those 3, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Andhra.
And
I
Dr.
agree.
Ayres?
I would say either of those 3.
Okay, we've got 3 instead of 2. I yield back.
I'm going to turn to Mr. Shabbat. Before you get to ask the witnesses questions, we're all kind of wanting to know from you who's going to win in Ohio tonight.
I have no idea.
Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Many consider the U.S.-India relationship an indispensable one, and I tend to believe that myself. India is already a regional economic powerhouse and could potentially become one of the most important powers in the world. And I think the U.S. has, for the most part, succeeded in fostering this relationship over the years. For more than a decade, the U.S. has committed to working with India to ensure a lasting strategic relationship. Both countries identify our bilateral trade ties as an integral component to our relationship moving forward. And I'd stress, as I have in past hearings on this topic, I chaired this committee in the previous previous Congress, that it's essential for the administration to continue proactive engagement with India. Many of us in Congress and in the administration welcomed Prime Minister Modi's ascension to power with pretty significant enthusiasm. Now, however, I'm beginning to hear skepticism about the Modi government's follow-through in some areas. For example, its commitment to promoting stronger economic relations. I'm particularly concerned with India's commitment to respect intellectual property rights. And the administration should take the necessary steps to ensure that American innovations are afforded the safeguards that they deserve, and that our American businesses, particularly our small businesses — I happen to be the chairman of the House Small Business Committee now — that our small businesses can rely upon this administration and the federal government to do everything it can to protect their interests. After all, if we want to continue to be the world leader in international trade, we must continue to prioritize these kinds of issues. Now for a couple of questions. Last fall, the International Trade Commission found that the Modi government had made no changes to its laws to address longstanding intellectual property-related trade barriers. Moreover, India's long-awaited IPR policy is rumored to be far less of an improvement than hoped. Is India backsliding on these issues? What can we do to get India to create a level playing field for our exporters and our investors? And I'd be happy to hear from any of the panel members on this. Dr. Ayres?
I'll offer some initial thoughts on that. First, I think in the IPR conversation, we should probably split the discussion to talk first about copyright issues, and then secondly, IPR concerns in other industries. know the pharmaceutical industry in the United States has some deep concerns about India's IPR regime. On the copyright side, there's actually been a lot of good news, and that has been an arena where you've seen Indian industry, particularly India's media and entertainment industry, step up and request its state-level governments and its government at the federal level to put in place stronger protections for copyright. So that has actually happened, and I think you now have seen over the course of the last decade a real convergence of views in the entertainment space. So whether it's songwriting or a script or a film, we've now, I think, got agreement with the regime in India on copyright. IPR, as you referred to, is much more difficult. I don't believe that India is backsliding, but I don't believe that their patent law has moved in any way in a direction that would be satisfactory to what people in the United States are looking for. I know that the Indian government recently received an opinion from the World Trade Organization that supported India's patent law. So I do not anticipate that that positive opinion they received from the WTO would suggest to Indian lawmakers a necessity for them changing their own law. What that tells me is I think we are going to continue to see a lot of fireworks over the IPR issues, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, for the next several years. I don't see this as an issue that's going to be easily remedied.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dhume?
I would just add very quickly that I would share the characterization that there has been neither concrete forward movement nor visible backsliding. I think that on the positive side, we have some of the fears that people had 2 or 3 years ago about, for instance, compulsory licensing have not come to pass. Things have sort of been frozen in place, but it certainly does seem that the area of concern would probably be things like drug pricing, where it's a very live political issue in terms of how much companies should charge, and that's the area that I would be paying the most attention to.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Do we have time to hear from Mr. Rossow? Thank you. Yes, sir.
I agree with actually what both said, that areas like development of film and content, things like that, where India has an offensive interest, we've got a lot of alignment, but on pharmaceutical, our industries are based on different models. And so it's very difficult for us to kind of bridge that gap. It's absolutely night and day. So to find common ground in that scenario is extremely difficult. You know, Sadanand mentioned on pharmaceutical pricing is kind of a new issue that we see. I think new attempts to regulate pricing, and also medical devices is another issue that's kind of like related to that we're seeing. So nothing further than what my colleagues had said on that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow up some of the questions I thought in terms of India's relationships to its neighbors, per se. Can you tell us how it's improving trade, or what its trade relationships are with Pakistan, with China, with Sri Lanka? Where is that moving in? And maybe explain to us how India is dealing with its regional partners.
Perhaps I'll take a stab at that, and then my colleagues might have some additional thoughts. China is India's largest trading partner in goods. We've heard earlier the United States is India's largest trading partner in goods and services, but China is India's #1 in goods. So it has a very robust economic relationship with China. India is not happy with the balance of its trade with China. India feels that it is sending out raw materials and importing finished goods. So it is unhappy about the trade balance and the composition of trade. With Pakistan, India has an extremely limited trade relationship. In 1994 or 96, I would have to check my notes, India granted Pakistan Most Favored Nation recognition. Pakistan has never reciprocated that, so they don't have a free and open trade. There's been some studies done that suggest that they could, you know, they've got trade diversion that goes through the Gulf, through the United Arab Emirates, instead of going across the border by land, where it could be carried out quite easily. Previous Indian governments and the Indian and Pakistani private sector have tried to use trade initiatives to try to be a kind of leading edge to improve ties. But without that most favored nation recognition and some sort of larger push on trade, it's hard to see a larger improvement on the trade ties. With the smaller countries around India, there is an open border with Nepal, so they have free and open trade and movement of persons anyway. India has a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka that has expanded their trading relationship significantly. And India recently completed a boundary reorganization with Bangladesh, and they have significantly expanded the trade with Bangladesh. So economic ties with Bangladesh has been a big focus for the Indian government.
I agree with all of that. I just say that if you were to look at India and you look around it, basically with all the smaller countries, trade relations have been improving, deepening, barriers have been lowered. The two problems are China and Pakistan for different reasons. The India-China relationship in some ways is like the US-China relationship in terms of trade. It's lopsided. India has market access issues. Nonetheless, it's a very large economic partner. With Pakistan, it's really a question of access. And the key over there is that India would like to see trade dealt with as a separate issue and trade to be pursued, whereas Pakistan would like trade to be linked to other issues such as security, and that's been a sticking point.
I'll just tie in a loop your question and the chairman's question, actually. The sectors that I mentioned where India has restrictions on foreign trade, whether it's solar, electronics, IT, telecom equipment, this is pretty much China's top exports to India. So when these issues came up, it wasn't a reaction because, of course, we have a trade deficit with India. It's exactly explicit, not explicitly, but going after the areas where China has major exports to India. India's trade balance overall, is declining in the last couple of years, as a lot of countries are, but their trade deficit with China continues to go up. So that's even been augmented while they've been reducing oil imports and other things as prices come down.
Thank you. And I just have one other question. You've all touched on, and I think, Dr. Ayres, you talked about it also, about some of the legal protections or lack thereof in India. I'm just wondering, is the legal system or the rule of law attractive enough for foreign investment into India now? Do companies believe that they have the kinds of legal protections that they need? Anyone, John, want to?
I think large companies do. Large companies that have the resources when cases come up to prosecute it effectively, hire the best law firms, get it through the appeals process to higher courts where you're going to get a very good hearing. They've managed to do fairly well. Some major cases involving some of the biggest investors in the country, recently Vodafone, a few years before that Morgan Stanley with the big tax case, they managed to get those all the way to the Supreme Court of India in just a couple of years. But it's the small and medium businesses, I think. For them, where maybe they don't have the kind of resources to put towards the case, they'd have to churn it out just like Indian companies would, that sometimes can take several years to get through. So I think it moves fast enough, and it's fair for large companies with the resources to spend the time and energy to do it. Small and medium companies, I think they continue to be concerned about this. So I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I think you could divide that into bird's eye view and worm's eye view. From a bird's eye view, it looks great. British legal system, rule of law, and all of that. From the worm's eye view, for firms, it often depends from case to case, and it can be messy and time-consuming. But by and large, if you sort of look at India and compare it to most of the developing world in Asia, I'd say that rule of law is generally seen as one of the positive attributes of India.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Aloha, welcome. Since 2008, the U.S. and India have signed more than $10 billion in defense contracts, and the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative has been a priority in these bilateral security relations, especially now with Secretary Carter as our Secretary of Defense. I think this has continued to be a priority. Can you speak to your assessment of how the DTTI is working, and if there are impediments, what are they and how can they be overcome?
So I'll offer a couple thoughts. I know my fellow panelists have been thinking about this one as well. The DTTI seems to be going very well. As with almost everything involving negotiating some sort of agreement with India, it's not happening overnight, and I don't think that should surprise us. But the fact that we have seen an increase first in the defense procurements, which is good for our economy as well as good for India's developing its defense and security capacity, The fact that we now have these Pathfinder projects that are moving ahead, the fact that we have seen a change in India's FDI policy when it comes to the defense sector, moving that FDI cap from 26 to 49%, with the possibility of up to 100% on a case-by-case basis. These are all positive movements that have been helpful to the defense industry, and I would anticipate that as discussion of the projects, the Pathfinder projects continue, we'll come together and be able to produce something and develop something with India. So I consider that moving quite positively.
Before you respond, if I'll just add to the question about these 3 foundational agreements that I hear from Admiral Harry Harris and others frequently about being so critical to enhancing U.S.-India partnerships and their hope that India will sign those foundational agreements. You could add that to your response of where you think that's at and if they'll sign.
On DTTI, I would add another sort of, broader reason for optimism is the Make in India policy that was mentioned earlier, and also raising on foreign investment caps in India and the defense sector. So there is genuine optimism that there will be more U.S. investment and genuine partnership over there, including in defense manufacturing, and there's certainly a lot of interest in that in India. On the logistical agreements, I don't know what the latest on that is, but my understanding is that with the new Defense Minister Parker, there is a greater interest in India going ahead and signing those agreements than we had in the previous administration.
Thank you.
I think the previous administration and the fact that they had such strong support from the communist parties in India, they managed to tilt the discussions over the foundation agreements so that it sounded like India was giving away the store, that a logistics sharing agreement meant that we had open basing with India, that we had backdoor channels where we could steal communications from the equipment we sold. The fact that the communists are no longer a force, the BJP is not reliant upon them, that voice, I think, that managed to sink it last time around when those talks began 8 years ago is gone. So that leaves an open door. I mean, it's in the press right now that these talks are happening, and you don't feel that kind of blowback against it. So I think the stage is set for progress on the foundation agreements. On the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, I think that exactly exhibits why long-term vision is critical, because we put forward more than a dozen projects to the Indian side and got no response. But as soon as we started talking about aircraft carrier technology, jet engine, the things that hit exactly on where India saw its future strategic interests, as soon as we put those on the table as longer-term working groups, they came back and we got 4 project agreements. We got 4 agreements and then 2 which have resulted in project agreements. So, we've only got 4. 2 of those don't look like they're moving very fast. Hopefully we can get some new ones added to the list. But I see tremendous progress. And even if there's frustration occasionally that 2 of them aren't moving that quickly, it's talked about as one of the most tangent, coachable examples about where partnership goes. So in terms of a guiding star, I think it's also provided a great opportunity for us.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to really thank the panelists for giving us the opportunity today to learn more about the bilateral opportunities that exist, predominantly in the trade opportunities, but others as well. It's clear that India is moving in leaps and bounds, and that regardless of how these hearings turn out, they're going to continue to progress, and we need to figure out how to better partner with them on different ideas, because I think their success globally as well as success in the region, I think, can be enhanced by a strong U.S.-India relationship. And I, for one, am really hopeful that we can move forward with a bilateral investment treaty. I think that would be incredibly positive. There are other things that we've heard expressed, that the lawsuits tend to take a long, long time. On the average, I think 4 years to get resolved. And while big companies have the resources to stay the course, that becomes difficult. And with the pharmaceutical companies, the generic entry into the markets has been a concern. But as we move forward, I think that most of the issues are very resolvable, between our countries. And I would echo, what Mr. Barra said. When we were able to go to India, we were afforded great courtesies as far as opportunity to meet with Prime Minister Modi and virtually all of his cabinet for several hours. It showed me that they're keenly interested in strengthening the relationships with us. And so I think that's a real positive thing. So I'd like to really thank the panelists for coming today. I'd like to thank the ranking member. Would
I
you like
join
to-
you in those comments. I want
yeah,
to thank the
absolutely.
panel for coming here, and I look forward to the U.S.-India relationship not being our 10th largest trading partner in the future.
Absolutely, and let's do a better job. I do echo what Mr. Sherman says. Let's start doing a better job in getting our products over there. You know, China has really taken great advantage of us when it comes to that lopsided agreement, and we don't want to make the same mistakes with India. But thank you very much for being here today, and this committee is now adjourned.
Okay.
What? Oh, they did? Oh, wow, okay. So we might have those coming pretty quick.
How's it going, Tulsi? Good. How's your, are we going to do okay? I'm one of the few that have not.
When did you get it, Amy?
The what?
The email?
The email?
Like just now?
A few minutes ago.